Fascism is a very clear future for a lot of our societies unless we take a much more active stance against it. Organized, it's planned, it's systematic, it's funded, it's a real movement and party and goals and aspirations, mechanisms and working. If you don't call it fascism, well then you've helped the fascists erase the bad stuff that they've done. Because if justice is not done for acts that terrible and that grave, a democracy never regains its sense of power and confidence and strength.
Welcome to episode 48 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. RefuseFascism.org was initiated on an emergency basis in the wake of the election of Trump and Pence in 2016. Our founding mission called on all who recognized the catastrophic danger of the Trump-Pence regime to unite and organize to drive the regime out of power through sustained, nonviolent mass protest. We pledged the world that we would not stand aside while there was still a chance to stop a regime that imperiled humanity and the earth itself. With our slogan, "In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America," and our single unifying demand, the Trump-Pence regime must go. Our actions over the last 4 years reflected a respect for the people of the world, in stark contrast to the hate and bigotry of the Trump-Pence regime. Trump's Make America Great Again was a 21st century fascist program of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia. America First wrapped in the flag and Mike Pence's Bible taken literally. A theocratic Christian fascist movement formed its most organized base, their hatred of science fused with Trump's pathological lying to allow the most outlandish and dangerous conspiracy theories to flourish. The destruction of truth and objective reality is one of the core characteristics of fascism, paving the way for its consolidation. Meanwhile, an unrelenting barrage of outrages normalized white supremacist murders, children in cages, concentration camps at the border, threats of fire and fury on whole countries, and hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths in this country alone. A second Trump term would have set us on an accelerated course to consolidated fascist rule and an existential nightmare for humanity. This was narrowly averted through an election that was nothing less than a showdown over the form of rule in this country, an election that Trump and his goons fought to overturn. That we narrowly averted this nightmare is a relief. The emergency that prompted the founding of Refuse Fascism is over, for now. Taking the time to sum up the experience of the last 4 years while recognizing that the need to prevent a fascist regime from coming to power may reassert itself again is a necessary part of charting a course forward. This virulent fascist movement, with its millions of followers, is regrouping on the lie of a stolen election and the toxic stew of Trumpism, and the conditions that gave rise to this fascism still exist and will continue to fuel this movement. That half of our founding mission was met without millions taking to and staying in the streets to drive out the regime during the 4 years that Trump was in power would have strengthened the people in our struggle to truly repudiate the whole fascist movement and program is something that everyone who cares about humanity needs to confront. Refuse Fascism is beginning a process of summation, and we want to hear your thoughts. Now is the time for all of us to deepen our understanding of this fascist movement, where it came from, what has changed and what hasn't, and how people with a heart for the people of the world and the planet can act to stop fascism from re-seizing power. This is what we aim to do on this show as we bring people from many different perspectives who are sounding the alarm on the continuing danger of American fascism. Tonight, we are airing an interview with Umair Haque, the founder of Hegemonia and Company, and we're doing this the closing night of CPAC. I just finished listening to the first half of Trump's speech. I had to stop It was so painful. This year's conference has served as a 6-week reunion for the January 6th coup planners, with Hawley receiving a standing ovation when he mentioned his vote to overturn the election, where a golden statue of Trump was seen wheeled through the crowd. Trump won the annual straw poll with 55% of the vote. Some are fooling themselves into thinking conservatives are moving on. But number 2, by a long shot, was his protege DeSantis. And 95% said they want the GOP to continue with Trump's agenda and policies. CPAC is making their unhinged aggression towards trans people central to this year's Golden Calf Conference. It's despicable, it's deadly, and it's straight out of the Nazi playbook. From the Otto-Rune stage, Ted Cruz upheld killing Black Lives Matter protesters if they came to the suburbs. Code for white neighborhoods. Hashtag Cruz is a joke was trending. But the reality is he's no joke. He's deadly serious. He's a fascist. He's a white supremacist. Trump's nauseating speech this evening was so heavy with white supremacy, it was difficult to breathe through it. He repeated the big lie and alluded that he may run again. He told his rabid fascist base that their American identity was at stake. And he assured the crowd at CPAC that he won't form a new party. Why would he? When the majority of the Republican Party has shown they embrace the fascist program Trump was working on consolidating for 4 years, complete with a violent attempted coup. He is them, they are him. We can either treat the Nazi GOP as a legitimate political party, a movement to be compromised, debated, worked with, or we can recognize they are fascist, have difficult, fruitful dialogue amongst decent people about how to stop fascism. We can't do both. We'll have more analysis on CPAC, so be sure to sign up for our e-newsletter and follow us on social media at Refuse Fascism. Good evening and welcome, Umair Haque, editor of Hegemonia and Company, Bad Words, a book of knights, leadership in the age of rage, and is a Hegemonia top writer in life, politics, culture, and leadership. You've likely read, if you're a listener to this podcast, many of Umair's incisive essays. Thank you for joining us, Umair.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I like to start off with those easy questions. What gave rise to this American fascism?
10 years ago, I was writing at Harvard Business Review. Right? I had this blog / column, whatever you want to call it. My kind of thing was to look at the economy, and I came to a very uncomfortable place where the more I looked at the American economy, it became really apparent to me that bad things were on the horizon. And really the turning point came for me one day, I think it was in 2011, when I looked at a statistic that just blew my mind. And the statistic was that the middle class in America had become a minority for the first time. And to somebody like me that has studied economics, that is the worst thing that you can hear. I mean, it's something that really rings 9 alarm bells. And I'll tell you why. Because what happened in the 1930s was that's what happened to Germany. So you had the Weimar Republic, middle class declined, sudden sharp poverty set in, downward mobility set in, people's debts spiraled out of control, hyperinflation set in, people couldn't make a kind of decent living anymore. And that's what really lit the fuse for the Nazis. Coming from an economic perspective, I have a very simple and what I would call a classical theory of fascism. And the reason I call it classical is because it's the first, and to my mind, still the best theory that explained to emerge how fascism happens and what it is. It was proposed by John Maynard Keynes, who's the great economist that he pioneered the work about how do we get out of depressions. He helped rebuild the globe after World War II. And so he took a look at what was happening in Germany and said, when a society falls into a period of economic decline like this, suddenly, sharply, then what tends to happen more or less is fascism. And the reason that happened in Germany was because they had war debts from World War I that they had to repay to Britain and France. And those debts were so steep that they plunged the entire German economy into ruin. And the average German simply couldn't repay them. And as I continue to think about this, the period of that next few months, year, it became very eerily clear to me. This is exactly what was happening in America. The average American also saddled with huge debts that they can't repay. And they're not war debts like they were in the case of Germany. We have new and strange names for them in America. Student debt, medical debt, lunch debt. Go down the list of weird forms of debt that everybody's on the hook for. And so I began looking at those numbers. I was shocked to find that the average American dies in debt. Dies in a huge amount of debt, 60 to 70 grand worth of debt. What does that mean? It means the average American never effectively owns or saves or earns a penny over the course of a lifetime. To somebody like me, it's depression and stagnation that light the fuse of fascism. Always. Because what fascism is, it's a modern phenomenon. We can't trace it back in history. It requires all these modern things to really happen. And one of those modern things is a middle class. And so fascism is kind of what happens when a middle class expects upward mobility, finds itself moving down. They begin to punch down, middle and working, you can include the working class, on people even more powerless than them. And who are those guys? Those are the minorities in society, the really powerless. So for the Germans, it was the Jews. In America, it was Latinos, Hispanics, Muslims, God knows who else. And these currents, it's important to note, are not just isolated to America. So when I predicted this, I then asked, so the rest of that year, I looked around the world and I saw that these economics are happening everywhere. Sure enough, it didn't just happen in America. It happened in India, it happened in Britain, it happened in Europe. It's happening all over the world. The economic dynamics are all the same. You have middle class, average person stagnation or depression. Huge inequality. People at the top getting richer. And what happens is that old racial, ethnic hatreds just explode all over again. Because that average guy is like, well, hey, what happened to my life? I was supposed to be moving up in the world. I was supposed to have a nice house and a nice car, whatever. What happened? And some idiot demagogue comes along and says, hey, it's their fault. Those guys, the ones who are different from you, who we've always hated, who we've always thought were a little suspect or out to get us or dangerous or lazy or dirty or whatever. The old racial hatred comes back, riding the wave of depression, explodes when the fuse of poverty is lit. Happened all over the world. So in America, that target was Hispanics and Latinos, and disproportionately and Muslims and Jews. In India, it was Muslims. In China, it's the Uyghurs. In Britain, weirdly, it's Europeans, right? I mean, so these guys are scapegoating Europeans for their economic problems. But that's kind of the genesis of it. So to me, it always has economic roots, if that makes sense.
Do you see a role that global warming and the connected mass migration have played? Do you think that that intersects?
Well, in America, we have a especially complicated situation. We have a huge influx from across the border that we call illegal immigration, right? So we put this kind of phrase on it. And it doesn't do anybody any good. It's a problem that nobody seems to be able to solve because it's a problem that is seen as a problem in itself. And so the question that needs to be asked is, why are all these people coming across the border? What happened to them? They must be in pretty desperate shape to want to come to a country like America. Let's just put that out there, because I don't see anybody from Sweden or France desperately trying to get to America. I mean, America is itself a failed state, but those guys must be even worse off. So what happened to those poor guys? Not to put it too bluntly for listeners or anything, but we destroyed Central America as Americans. We fought this bizarre war on drugs, and then we fought a bizarre war on communism, and most of our neighbors were casualties. We destroyed Central America with impunity. We sent fascists roaming the streets of Nicaragua and Chile. You can go down the list and read the books about it, but we destroyed those. And the kind of net effect of that was to send a huge wave of migration our way, because of course these people are going to flee to the only place that is safe, which is the place that's destroying their countries. Just calling this issue illegal immigration is really completely missing the point. You can't stop a human tide that big. And that's kind of a window into the future of climate change. So there need to be real considerations made. I mean, we have to get to the real root causes of some of these problems. It's not complicated when you think about it in a reasonable way. It's the same thing for climate change. Maybe people are that desperate that they're willing to put their lives on the line just to get to a place of safety. The question then is, well, if you don't take steps to go back and solve the root cause of that problem, then you are going to give the fascists so much more power and so many more opportunities, just like we have in America. In America, the left and right both buy the frame of illegal immigration. And neither side says, hey guys, we destroyed those countries and we need to do something actually constructive and good and decent to help these people, to make some amends for this terrible thing that we've done. And then maybe we're all better off and those guys have a place to live in. You know, we have a place to live too. All that happens in the vacuum of kind of real and practical solutions to these serious issues is that the fascists take control. What is fascism? Fascism is just violence at the end of the day, right? It's racialized, institutionalized violence. And so these guys come up with the same solution that the Nazis did, which is, well, we don't like these guys and we think they're subhumans and we're going to build concentration camps and put Gestapos in the concentration camps and put kids in cages. The question is, how much can you scale that up? China has 1 million people in concentration camps. We don't know, you and me, how many people the Trump administration had. We have no idea. We don't know what abuses were committed there, right? I mean, we have allegations of sexual abuse. We have forced hysterectomies. I mean, it's stuff, mind-blowing stuff. And so unless we go back in time and say, where did these issues come from? Start really addressing some of them. Take real steps to address it, man. The fascists are going to eat us for lunch. We still have a very disconnected view of all these things. If I say fascism to an American now, they kind of know what I'm talking about a little because they've seen Trump and they've seen the events of Jan 6 and the attempted coup and the concentration camps and the whole 9 years. So they kind of get it. But to really make it real for them, to help explain to them that, fascism is a very clear future for a lot of our societies unless we take a much more active stance against it. Really, really try and force our politicians to go back and solve some of the big problems that are creating these larger issues. The future is almost set in stone. Let me go back one step to try and explain it, because I think that's a really important point. When I say the future is almost set in stone, when I looked at that statistic a decade ago, that the middle class has become a minority in the States, I knew instantly, without a shadow of a doubt, that a fascist wave was on the way. That's just history, right? That's like an iron law of economics. The middle class cannot just collapse without a fascist wave. It's like a mountain dropping into the sea and then a tsunami happening. You might get a few minutes of delay, but the tsunami is going to hit you. But those problems are still very much there. It's not like the problems have gone away. It's not like the middle class has stopped collapsing in America or anywhere else around the world. So those economic problems are very much there, and they're only getting worse, in fact. In America, we do this thing of fascism is just cultural anxiety. All the white people are just suddenly woke up in 2016 and decided to be racists. That's not how life works. It's not like the world's biggest coincidence. On the same day in 2016, Britain voted for Brexit and America voted for Trump. It's not a coincidence. Half the world went racist in the 2010s.
Right. I'm not saying it's unique to Americans. I think this is broader, but something that Americans do better than anyone else is insisting on looking at the surface and an attempt for peeling anything back that will be ugly or uncomfortable or challenging us to look at the past because the past isn't past.
You're absolutely right to say that Americans struggle with complex issues. Now, I look at the American public sphere. I say this in a really alarmed way. Nobody in mainstream media has a theory of fascism. If I go to the New York Times, I go to the Washington Post, wherever the case may be, CNN, and I say, hey guys, we all know it's there. I mean, CPAC's happening this weekend, and you can see the fascism's right out there in the open. And I ask these guys, whoever they are, the columnists or the editors in chief or the anchorman, hey, what's your theory of fascism? They'll give me a blank look. Nobody has a working theory of fascism. And the reason we don't have a working theory of fascism in the States is because we're always looking for one variable explanation. In the case of fascism, the debate, such as it is, has boiled down to this really kind of naive thing of, well, either it's culture on the one hand, all the white people are just inveterate racists, or at least some huge number of them are just inveterate racists, or it's economics and politics on the other hand. Fascism is not like that. What Keynes was trying to teach us all those decades ago was that this is a very complex and multi-layered, multi-variable phenomenon. What you tend to get is every society has a long, long history of racism. Every single society in the world. What tends to happen is that economic depressions and stagnations come along. And they reignite those old ethnic tensions or racist tensions or sectarian tensions. And those then spill over into the cultural sphere. So you have this multi-layered system. You have this really complex process of economic, society, politics, all working in culture, all working together. And that's when you get fascism, when all of those planets align. And it's a big problem, especially in the States, not to have any understanding of that. Because if you don't have any understanding of that, you remain powerless to fight.
Yeah, that last point about the powerless that comes from failure to confront it is something that you have been extremely consistent on. And I wanted to quote for our listeners from a piece that you wrote, America is already forgetting about fascism and it's going to price. Umair wrote, it seems to me that America's forgetting all over again, but this time we're not talking about forgetting some kind of minor league scandal. We're talking about forgetting fascism, forgetting the way America does, desperately, deliberately, willfully, not naturally or gracefully or thoughtfully, which is to say slowly, integrating a traumatic period into a larger sense of self. But the way the drug addicts try to forget self-medicating to numb the pain of their hurt, that's the way America is forgetting. He goes on to say forgetting becomes complicity when it involves periods of violence, shame, ruin, collapse. That is what America has just experienced and still is. The Republicans who think it's okay to storm Congress with death squads haven't gone anywhere. There are more of them today than there were 6 weeks ago, willfully ignoring, deliberately, desperately, foolishly, mistaking the most difficult truths about America right now. And that is the biggest mistake perhaps a society can make. I was wondering if you could speak to why does it matter for people in this country to name and fully confront what we experience and so narrowly escape under Trump? And what continues, you alluded to CPAC, literally a golden shrine to what was a meme, I don't know, 2-3 years ago is now an actual event.
It's the most important thing. When I write this stuff, and that was a painful piece to have to write, I speak from not just a place of I studied it, but I've lived it. I've lived in many societies that have collapsed at the hands of fascists. I mean, I was getting death threats as a teenager for writing like this in societies with much more advanced tastes of fascism. So, and what I've learned from it is something that I try to teach Americans. This is they're very, very resistant to hearing it, which is that you have to call it what it is. And there are like 3 or 4 interlinking reasons you have to do that. Job number 1. The first reason, if I say these guys had a riot, maybe you think of people stealing a VCR in the 90s or something. If I say these guys led a fascist coup, it's suddenly you're thinking, your mind is working. You're like thinking of the Nazis or the beer hall putsch or like, Goebbels or whatever. You're thinking. All of a sudden, this huge, rich vocabulary, conceptual language of history comes into play. Well, what is fascism? This is a thing of genocide. This is a thing of purges. This is a thing of bans. This is a thing of hate. You have this whole mental model begins to pop into your head. The first reason it's important is that it brings us towards naming the thing as it really is. Unless we're able to do that, we're always just kind of shadow boxing, right? Or kind of like punching in the dark, and maybe sometimes a hit lands, but most of the time they don't. Reason number 2, without naming it, there's nothing that you can hold people accountable for. So what happened on January 6th? Well, we call it an insurrection. This is like an 18th century term. When was the last time there was an insurrection in the modern world? The rest of the planet calls them coups. I don't see anybody else saying we had an insurrection in Myanmar or Russia or whatever. So we had a coup. And so if you don't call it fascism, well, then you've helped the fascists erase the bad stuff that they've done. What are you going to hold them accountable for exactly? It's not just some random act of spontaneous violence, which is what an insurrection kind of points to. Organized, it's planned, it's systematic, it's funded, it's a real movement and party and goals and aspirations, mechanisms and workings. When we don't say the word, we kind of strip all that away. In the same way that when I say insurrection, it's like, well, what does that mean? I don't know. Slaves nobly rising up against their owners? Was it merchants dumping tea into the harbor? What was it exactly? It could be a lot of things. But if you say it's a fascist coup, there's a lot more clarity that comes with it. And that lets you hold people accountable. The third reason is America has a really ugly history. And in the last few years, we've taken some steps, and I would say they're good steps, and in some cases even big steps, to kind of reckoning slavery, segregation, hate, centuries of it. And the way that we are taught about fascism in America, and you have to remember, I grew up in many places, so I have a kind of different perspective on this. The way that we're taught about fascism in America is completely wrong and completely backwards, right? So when I ask the average American, what's your definition of fascism? I get this really weird definition that they're taught in high school, which is like, fascism is the convergence of economic and political interests. It's like, well, that's not fascism, man. Fascism is some dude with an SS insignia who wants to kill me and everybody like me. So a lot of Americans don't understand fascism to begin with because the way that they learn about it is completely wrong. And the reason that that definition is wrong is because that was actually the definition of forms of communism. And so Americans were trying to demonize socialism and communism with this weird definition of fascism. That has nothing to do with real fascism. And the reason it's important for us to begin undoing all that is because the Nazis studied us. They admired us. When the Nazis were figuring out how to exterminate and annihilate and oppress the Jews, you know who they studied? America. Explicitly, they would write things like, oh, we think America is so great. They managed to oppress a whole race of people. It's the only time it's ever been done. My God, what geniuses these people are. So went out and studied Jim Crow and the race laws and slavery. I mean, they literally went out and went way out of their way to study American history. We have a really ugly history. And the way that we understand fascism as Americans is totally wrong, totally backwards. We think fascism is something that came out of nowhere in Europe in 1935. And it just happened one day, right? And the Germans woke up one day and they were like, oh my God, we got to kill all the Jews. That's not what happened at all. Fascism started here. And so to really understand fascism, we need a whole new model of it, theory of it, culture. The words kind of fail at this point. Maybe paradigm is the best word. A whole different way of looking at it.
I think that part of it is a paradigm shift. It's not a battle over definition. If we define it perfectly, it's about people being able to notice a pattern that keeps reasserting itself.
Exactly right.
And will keep reasserting itself until the root that brings it to being is addressed. I think that is a huge thing that I appreciate. And one of your recent pieces, you were struggling with people to ask questions. You were struggling with people to look at why is it that people think about that? I think you were struggling with people who were saying, are you really saying that 70 million people in this country are fascist? I think that was the article. Yes, but let's talk about the deeper questions.
Let's talk about it. Yes. Look, one of the things I said in that piece was that if you think for a second that I am trying to give you some kind of story where the fascists are the bad guys and I'm not a fascist and I'm a good guy and the world is us, that's not what I'm saying at all. So I grew up on the other side of the world And they have the same problems of racism and caste and class and fascism that we do too. It's a universal thing. And we're not talking about like semantics and like we're not playing intellectual games here. We all know fascism when we see it. It's pretty simple to know. And that's because at the core of it is something really serious, somebody trying to take away your personhood. So if you think I'm giving you a story where like, those guys are the fascists and I am not the fascist, that's not the story I'm giving you at all. The story I'm trying to tell is that human history is really, really kind of steeped in these ideas that I am better than you. And they go way, way deep and way, way back. It could be like white against black, or it could be like in India, caste against caste, or what have you. Or it could just be human against animal. These ideas go so far back in human history. And then the consequent idea, which follows on from it, which is that I'm better than you, so it's my job to enslave you, oppress you, consume you, subjugate you, whatever. We have to undo all of that, or else our civilization goes up in smoke. Fascism is one aspect of that ultimate idea of domination and violence. Climate change is another, and mass extinction is yet another, right? The fundamental idea is the same. I am the chosen one, and I get to do whatever I want with you because you are not a person. Right. So one of the things I say to the left is, we have to be much, much more aggressive and much, much more visionary in saying we have the real way to fight fascism, in my opinion, is to expand the frontiers of personhood. These guys are trying to reduce the boundaries of personhood. So they're like, oh, the only real people are like white dudes of a certain kind. And we play a very small game on the left, right? We're like, well, no, that's a bad thing. And no, everybody's person. That's true. There's one way to fight it, a better way to fight it, and the way it needs to be fought is to say, hey, we need to be expanding personhood way, way, way outside where we think it's possible. We need to be giving personhood to the animals and the trees and the forests and the oceans and the river. And the reason I say that is because the fight against fascism has always been about expanding the boundaries of personhood. If we go back a very, very short time in human history, 100 years ago, who was a person? Women weren't people. Minorities weren't people. It's only really in the last, 50 years maybe? 70, 30, depending on how you counted, women and minorities became full persons in society. We have to keep fighting that battle instead of letting the fascists claim all of personhood for themselves.
I think it makes a lot of sense personally, and this is not shared by, nor does it need to be shared by all those who listen to the Refuse Fascism podcast, and definitely not those who see themselves as part of the movement in any way. But I think that the economic system that exists, that dominates the whole globe, capitalism is a system that limits, diminishes personhood. And I think that it is the system that gives rise to fascism. And I think that property relations have everything to do with personhood. And it's an important conversation to have. But that is not how society at large sees people, right?
No, but that may be an even bigger problem. One of the things that I've observed, both as somebody who's survived fascism and has studied fascism, is that it's not just about the fascist. There's another critical set of institutions that you need for fascism to take over. And one of those is the silent majority. Another one of those is the missing opposition. And what really happened in America to enable fascism was the fact that we got a silent majority and a missing opposition. I remember back in 2016, 2017, I was like, hey, they're putting kids in camps. Isn't that fascist? Hey, they're Gestapos. Putting the kids in cages. Isn't that fascist? And everybody was like, don't be ridiculous. That's not fascist. I was like, well, that's not, I felt like I was living in a crazy movie, right? Like, if that's not fascism, what on earth could be fascism? So part of the problem, you're right, that society at large doesn't understand it. But it's very important to understand that fascism developing in a society is never just about the fascists. It's about them exploiting a vacuum, an economic vacuum that becomes a social vacuum that becomes a cultural vacuum. People get poor, their social bonds get torn apart, they begin living in despair and rage, and they turn to craziness. First, it's conspiracy theories, and it's like whack jobs and superstition, and pretty soon it's fascism. This is the story of the Islamic world. And you said another word there that's super important that I don't hear enough. The word is capitalism. In America, one thing I've learned, it's so infuriating to me that the moment I say capitalism, the American mind just shuts down. It's bizarre. So if I want to explain fascism to somebody really simply in Europe, I don't have to say more than 5 words. As capitalism implodes into fascism. In the States, if I say that, I get one of my 3 classic American reactions. I freeze. I get either a blank stare or I get like a crazy person telling me that capitalism worked because look at Jeff Bezos. I just get somebody thinking that I've insulted them. If you really think about capitalism, if you really think about, and by the way, we don't have to take an ideological stance on this in the sense that we don't have to be, oh, well, I'm a Marxist or, oh, well, I'm a diehard capitalist. Well, we just have to look at the evidence. So hundreds of years ago, Karl Marx said that, well, capitalism tends to collapse because there's a hole creates a hole in the economy, right? The rich get richer, the average guy gets exploited, and there's not enough left for him to consume, and the whole system collapses under its own weight. Marx said that as a result of that, there's going to be a glorious socialist revolution. Now, what happened in the 1930s, which was the first time this theory was really put to the test, was something that proved Marx simultaneously right and wrong. He was right that capitalism collapsed under its own weight, but he was wrong that there was a glorious socialist revolution. Instead, what happened was that capitalism turned into fascism. And so the generation of European scholars that followed Marx took this question really seriously. And they said, well, how the hell is it that this guy who was so brilliant predicted everything, but he got that final conclusion wrong? Capitalism did collapse under its own weight through speculation and exploitation and the rest of it. But instead, people turned to fascism. And they worked really, really hard to answer that question. And that is how we get to modern theories of fascism, which say that economies tend to stagnate, just like Marx said. But instead of that creating a kind of glorious revolution of the proletariat who are smart enough to see that the way out of this mess is to create a more communal or collectivist society, they get hoodwinked, exploit their prejudices that have been there for hundreds. It's a lot easier to punch down than it is to punch up. And that's the part that Marx kind of forgot. Or, we can forgive Marx because he was right about so much. He just missed that final tiny element at the very last stage of this collapse. Instead of punching up, people punch down. And that changes the whole pattern of history. Capitalism is totally missing from our discussion in the States. And it's 100% what fascism's about.
I think that what you brought forward, I really appreciate. And I just wanted to challenge listeners to think about how these crises can go either way, that there is a tremendous amount of dynamism that people broadly tend to not see, and a tremendous amount of notions of inevitability and determinism that people are trained to think as. And I think that it's worth people trying to be scientific about things that they don't want to be scientific about, and to look into things that they don't want to look into. And I wanted to move this conversation into our agency and the role that we can play. For years, you and I have shared a lot of frustration with the American people for failing to confront and resist the danger of fascism. And I'm wondering now, with Trump and the whole regime's departure from the White House, what do you hope people in this country will do? What role should we be playing?
I'm going to speak to you as a human being, and I'm going to speak to you as like this detached intellectual. Okay, so here's the answer from the detached intellectual. Okay, this is a textbook answer. The fight against fascism has 4 elements. Okay, so economics. How do we stop fascism from happening in Europe? We created a Marshall Plan. Now, here's a real paradox of history for you. Why is it after fascism happened in Europe, we were like, we got to give those guys a Marshall Plan? After fascism happened in America, we got to give ourselves a Marshall Plan, because I don't see a Marshall Plan coming from Congress. Do you? That's the first thing you got to do. You got to have a Marshall Plan that lifts people out of the poverty that produces fascism in the first place by reigniting all those old hatreds. The second thing you got to do is have some kind of justice, some kind of special level of justice. So again, after World War II, we had the Nuremberg trial, because it was recognized that the things the fascists did were not capable of being answered by everyday justice, because they were not forms of abuse that everyday justice was meant to cover, right? It wasn't just like murder or rape or what have you. Something much worse than that. We really need something like that. So let me give you the example of the allegations of sexual abuse in the camps. We don't know. Would a lot of kids make it up? Do you know what I mean? I doubt it, but we need to get to the truth. And if it is true, there needs to be justice. Because if justice is not done for acts that terrible and that grave, a democracy never regains its sense of power and confidence and strength. It goes on thinking of itself as a weak and feeble thing. All right, so 2 things. 1, Nuremberg trials. 2, Marshall Plan. The third thing is that people's attitudes really need to change. I should say the majority, right? So like after the war, it took a long time, but the average German had to come to reject fascism. And today they do. If you go to Germany, it's a very, very anti-fascist place, right? Wasn't easy. It's a huge project of social change. And that's really kind of cultural change. There has to be some campaign of like rooting the guys that created this mess out of positions of power and really holding them accountable. And I'll give you the example, and maybe it's mean of me, maybe it's harsh of me, I don't know. You guys can judge that and tell me. Why is it that we all knew that this was coming and happening, and we were frustrated and we're like, Jesus Christ, how can this be happening in our country? And meanwhile, you got New York Times columnists and Washington Post pundits, and they're like, is this really fascism? I don't know. Let us debate this in the abstract with 14 bullet points and 37 theorems. Man, these dudes should be out of a job and never work in media ever again. Are you kidding me? If I could predict the damn thing from a decade away, why do these jokers still have jobs? This is ridiculous. These guys, the guys who enabled fascism, really need to face a professional, if not personal, account. And I mean that seriously, because if they didn't see it last time, how are they going to see it next time? They don't even see what's happening right now all over again. So you need those 4 things. Nuremberg trial, Marshall Plan, social norms to change, and cultural accountability. Now, we can do a report card of those 4 things in the States, and you're not going to like my report card. Nuremberg trials for the fascists. Stephen Miller is on Fox News as a pundit. He's not in jail. He's on Fox News as a pundit. That's a laugh of despair, folks. That's not a laugh of glee. That Stephen Miller, the man who devised the concentration camps policy on Fox News as a pundit, that is a goddamn disgrace. And I mean it's a disgrace, because when I go out to the dog park here in Europe, everybody laughs at me for it. They're like, man, you guys are really dumb. And what am I supposed to say? This is a guy that put kids in concentration camps. He's not in jail. He's a pundit, right? So Nuremberg trial's not happening anytime soon. Marshall Plan, well, again, let's look at reality. Here's an even more grim reality. The Dems just caved on a minimum wage. Forget a Marshall Plan. We can't even get a minimum wage out of these guys. My third thing, which is social norms changing, I think we're doing better. The average person, I think, understands that something really sinister and really abnormal happened in America over the last 4 to 5 years. And I think they get it much more than the Democratic establishment. And so I think social norms are changing, right? You see the reckonings that are happening, and you see much more like minority representation in media. You know, we can kind of say the word fascism out in the open now, and you know, there's not some pundit jumping down your throat instantly being like, well, he's not Mussolini, is he? So social norms changing a little bit. Let's go to the fourth one, which is cultural accountability. Again, no progress, man. All those pundits are still exactly where they were. I mean, let me take the example, and maybe people hate me for using this example because they love this guy, but I can't deal with this guy, Joe Scarborough. Morning Joe, the whole time Trump was rising to power, Morning Joe was like, my man, Donald Trump. Wow, look at this guy. He's going to save America. Go, Donald Trump, make America great again. And then 3 years later, after kids are in camps, Morning Joe is suddenly, oh, I'm anti-Trump. And good, I don't mind if Morning Joe is, I'm anti-Trump, but what I do want from the Morning Joes of the world is I'm sorry, I was wrong. It should never happen again. And maybe I need to give up my seat at the table to somebody else, a woman, a minority, anybody else who was right about this. Because those guys, if they're still in the position of power, it's very difficult for culture to ever really change. And we can tinker around the edges of culture, right? This whole Mr. Potato Head controversy that happened the other day, like, oh no, there's no more Mr. and Potato Head. It's great. You know, we can change like gender norms and these things. And that's great. That's a worthwhile fight. But larger battle of freeing culture from the fascist, from the assumptions which undergird modern fascism, which are beliefs in hidden beliefs in supremacy and control and domination and violence and all these things, very difficult to do if those guys are still in their positions of power trotting out their same nonsense. It would take me 5 hands to count how many pundits wrote articles that were like, Donald Trump isn't Hitler, or like, Donald Trump, everything's going to be fine, don't worry about Donald Trump, or he won't get elected, or like, even if he is elected, what's the big deal? Certainly not a single one of these guys was, oh, you know what, there's going to be a violent coup on Congress where 5 people die as they attempt to overturn the election results. And none of these guys will hold up their hands and say, I was wrong. So that's a seriously bad place for a society to be. That means you have no intellectual accountability. If I do a report card of America, no Nuremberg trials, no Marshall Plans, no intellectual accountability, small changes in social norms, it's not a good thing. What can we do? We can create changes in social norms. And I'm going to say something that will piss a lot of people off, but it's 100% true, and I say to you as a minority. If you are white, you have the power to do this, use it. Which is to say, you have the power to make you more equalist. You can for interactions in ways that minorities can't. If somebody's abusing someone on the street or just talking down to them, or you see somebody at work that is being discriminatory or something, you can do something about that. It's much harder for minorities to do that. The fight against fascism, at that level, the social level always has to start with the majority. Has to. We minorities can speak out against it endlessly, but our power is so limited, especially in American society. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is hold the Dems accountable. Tell them it's not okay. Call your congressman, call your senator, whoever it is, send Joe Biden an email. Man, I guarantee you that if, tomorrow 10,000 people called the White House and they were like, hey, Joe Biden, guess what? We don't think putting kids back in concentration camps is okay. At least they would get a message. There needs to be some level of political engagement from the left. And I say that warily. I certainly don't mean buy into the Dems and their bullshit. I mean it in the way of hold them accountable, because we have 2 years to fix this mess to the best extent we can, or else the bad guys are back in power. I think people get the impression, especially in America, that they're powerless and it doesn't matter. No, that's completely wrong. If you stand up for a minority at work or on the bus or whatever, if you stop that little act of aggression or fascism, you have changed something. Super important. If you can get your boss or your company or what have you to, change where they invest or put a little bit of money this way instead of that way, that's a big difference. Those things are what need to add up. And people in America, I think, are under the impression that those little actions are too small. It's completely the opposite. Remember the point of the silent majority. That's so crucial in development of fascism. So use your voice, use your power, use your agency. You have so much of it still. And don't take it for granted, because they that's their goal, right? They want to take that away from you. Use it or lose it. That's the maxim against these guys.
I wanted to close with one last question that I think goes along with what you're saying right now. And I wanted to start by quoting, I believe that it's your latest piece. You wrote, "Our civilization's history of violence is a difficult and subtle subject to grapple with, and it cannot be done when noted internet personalities are gaslighting minorities for talking about it. And that is what equating a joke or F white people to genocide or fascism is, gaslighting. To reckon with a history of violence is a hard thing. I admire anyone who has the courage to do it, but equally, I have contempt for those who choose not to." And so in order to build power to confront and stop fascism, I think we do need to create space in society to reckon with this history of violence. This can't simply be academic work off to the side, or even, as important as they might be, one-on-one conversations with people in one's life.
Yes.
How do you see doing this in more of a societal way?
You come to the heart of the problem, which is that we human beings exist in this matrix of violence and brutality. And some societies have done a much better job than others of pulling themselves out of that matrix of violence and brutality. Take Europe, for example. Take Canada, for example. In America, we're still this is not to say they're free of it, but freer of it than we are. We are still totally mired in it. I went to college in Canada, and I got there and I had no idea about Canada or America. I thought they were basically the same. I get to Canada, I get to my dorm room, and everybody's meeting each other. And I'm like, man, these people are so nice. There's got to be something wrong with these guys. They like this niceness. It must be a front for something seriously violent, right? There must be like, these be really bad people. And so I shut myself up in my dorm room for like 6 weeks, and I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't come out of my dorm room except to go to class. I'd like peek out, like literally, I would peek out the door and look at them. I was like, what, I know that this front is going to crack at some point, and I'm just going to look out and there's going to be like bloodshed on campus. But it never cracked. They really are that nice. It's the same thing in Europe. That's one of the reasons I came to Europe. So we in America don't understand this, the power of gentleness and kindness and holding and supporting and lifting each other up, even in tiny, tiny ways. One of the things that is so draining for me when I go back to America, and I don't think you really understand this until you've lived outside America, is just the way that Americans talk and relate to each other on an average level. It's very confrontational. It's very aggressive. It's very competitive. It's a capitalist society, right? These are the values that exist there: competition, individualism, acquisition. But Americans don't understand that permeated every aspect of life. And so then they go up to Canada, maybe for a vacation. They're like, oh, Canadians are so nice. Man, I don't get it. How can these people be so nice? Yes, they are nice because they're trying to really give each other gentleness and dignity and warmth and support. They do it in every tiny interaction. I know that that's a very strange and weird thing to say, right? And it's like a lot of Americans are probably like, what the hell is this guy talking about? That's the point. You have to make an effort to do that. I know that sounds stupid. It sounds inane, but I can't tell you how important it is. These are the living expressions of values between capitalist society and a social democracy. In a capitalist society, we are only allowed to live the values of competition and aggression and hostility and acquisition. And in America, it's killing us. Nobody is happy to live that way. Nobody wants to get up and go to work and be surrounded by other people who are just as miserable, and we're all trying to hide it by being slightly bigger assholes to the next guy to get a big house or prize or car, whatever. Nobody's happy that way. So stop it. Stop living that way. Be nice. Be gentle. And if you do that enough, you can change the values of a society. Take it away from this capitalist mode of aggression and acquisition and further towards the spectrum of social democracy. Can you change a society like that single-handedly? No, but you can begin to change it a lot. And that is such a vital and crucial way to fight against, because fascism feeds on fear. It feeds on the feeling that you can't survive, that you can't make it. That's why it's linked to stagnation. It feeds on anxiety, it feeds on worry, it feeds on panic, and all those things are so omnipresent in American life. And you never know. You never know. It's true, right? Like, you never know in America. Like, you could get a bill or you could lose your job, and then that's it. Out on the street, you're done. I went to Canada. One of the things that really struck me was that minorities and white people relate in a way that's completely different to in America. So America, the first question I get, where are you really from? I'm from Washington, D.C., dude. Like, where are you really from? Cleveland? Like, what does the question mean? But in Canada, nobody asked that question, right? And we know this like slightly patronizing question. We know what it really is, right? It's like, in like my mental hierarchy of races and cultures. Nobody asked the question. This is where are you really from? And to my absolute surprise, the other kid, the minority kid, would just be like, oh, I'm from Ottawa. I'd be like, oh, cool. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like, no, where are you really from? It's a totally different way of relating. And we need to have that in America, right? I mean, the leftist in me, what little is left of the left in me after being beaten up by the world for so long, would call it solidarity. But we need to have some of that value that we can relate to each other as human beings, not just competitors, not just rivals, not just consumers or any of these, but human beings. If we cannot do that, I guarantee you that the fascists will win no matter how much we think we're winning the political fight. That is a fight that begins in every single interaction in a society. And in America, talk to your minority friends, talk to your foreign friends, and ask them if what I've just said doesn't ring true to them. I'll give you another example. When I go to the dog park in the States, the first question, always, the first question is, what do you do? You have to answer in a certain way. It's like people are trying to place you on the capitalist ladder. Are you a worker? Are you a prole? Are you a manager? Are you a capitalist? Are you a boss? What are you? So in Europe, in Canada, if you ask that question, what do you do? You're like, no one will ever talk to you at the dog park again. You cannot talk about anything in that sphere of life. You can talk about everything else. You can talk about like, what is the weather? What kind of dog do you have? Did you see that show on TV? It doesn't matter. But you can't talk about that stuff. You have to come at it from a place of equality with this person, not a place of inequality, not a place of domination, not a place of competition. So those things you can change, but it's hard work, right? You have to get in there and think about like, what am I saying that might be like hurting this other? Am I like looking at them in a way that is like bringing up this huge, ugly history of like, it's really subtle and hard work, but we are the guys that have to change it. We're all we have, man. Who else is there?
Well, I want to thank you so much, Umair, for taking the time to talk with us and for all the work that you in struggling with people to look deeper at what it is that is going on in the world and to ask important questions. So I want to thank you both for the time that you gave us today, but also for the time that you're giving us in your very frequent essays. I don't know how you do it. You can follow Umair on Twitter at Umair H. Thanks for listening to the Refuse Fascism podcast. I want to thank all of those who have been rating and reviewing. It means a lot. If you haven't done so yet, hit subscribe and be sure to rate and review. Share this podcast and previous episodes with your friends and family. We regularly share voices from those living around the world. For more international voices, I encourage you to listen to episode 44 with Sean Norris on the anti-abortion movement, and episode 37, which features Ruchir Gupta speaking about the lessons we need to learn from the fascist movement in India around Modi. Transcribed excerpts of the last few episodes are now available at refusefascism.org, so be sure to check it out and share with others. While you're there, go ahead and click the donate button to help us reach more listeners, or support this show by giving via Venmo, refuse-fascism, or Cash App, Refuse Fascism. I want to hear your thoughts on this episode or other episodes, what you're thinking about the continuing danger of fascism, its roots, what gave rise to it, and what you think needs to be done. Send me your thoughts via email, samanthagoldman at refusefascism.org, or sambygoldman on Twitter. Thanks as always to Richie Marini and Lena Thorne for producing the show, and Coco Das for contributing to opening commentary. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Stay safe, not silent.